The sun was shining softly over the tall white buildings of the Royal Military Academy. It was a special day, graduation day. Families were arriving one by one, all dressed in their best clothes. Proud parents, smiling siblings, and a few young children walked around, searching for their seats, holding cameras, phones, and flowers. Excitement floated in the air like music before a show. In the middle of all this, a man stood quietly in a corner of the large ceremonial hall. His name was Major Charles Whitcomb. He wore his Royal Guard uniform, polished and perfect, with every medal in place. He wasn't one for smiles or big shows of emotion, but today, his heart was full. His son Liam was graduating at the top of his class, a proud achievement not only for Liam, but for the entire Whitcomb family legacy. Charles had served his country for over 25 years. He had trained, commanded, and led others through some of the most challenging times. But today, none of that mattered to him. All he wanted was to see his son walk across that stage. Charles looked around the hall. The flags were hanging perfectly, the chairs were lined up neatly, and the sound of quiet conversations filled the air. At the front of the room, a few seats had been marked for special guests, 2 of them reserved for visiting American officers. The Royal Academy often invited international guests, especially those with a long history of cooperation with the British forces. Sitting in those seats were 2 U.S. Navy SEALs, Commander Jake Rollins and Chief Petty Officer Mark DeVries. Both men were dressed in their formal dark blue uniforms, each carrying an air of quiet confidence. They had traveled a long way to attend this ceremony and had been invited not only as guests of honor, but also as representatives of the strong bond between the United Kingdom and the United States military. As Charles walked past them, his eyes locked briefly with Jake's. It was a small moment, but something changed in the air. A flash of recognition passed between them. Jake's posture stiffened and Mark leaned in slightly, whispering something under his breath. The 2 Americans exchanged a glance, not a friendly one. They knew Charles, not just by name or reputation, but personally. Years ago, during a joint mission involving both American and British forces, Major Whitcomb had made a decision that would be remembered for a long time. To some, it was the right call. To others, especially to Jake and Mark, it had cost something very dear. They hadn't spoken to him since that day, but now, here he was, dressed in full uniform, preparing to watch his son graduate. A moment that should have been proud and peaceful now felt complicated, Jake and Mark whispered again. They didn't want to cause a scene, especially not on a day meant to honor young officers. But the sight of Charles brought back old memories, not of anger, but of silence, confusion, and a deep feeling of something unfinished. The ceremony hadn't yet started. Guests were still being seated. Cadets were getting into position backstage. This short window of time gave the SEALs a chance, a moment to do something they had considered doing for a long time but had never gotten the chance to. Jake stood up first, followed by Mark. Together, they walked quietly across the aisle toward Charles. The room was still loud with chatter and laughter, so their presence didn't cause a stir. But as they came closer, Charles noticed. He turned slightly, not surprised to see them, but clearly not expecting a conversation. For a moment, no one spoke. Jake was the first to break the silence. "Major Whitcomb," he said calmly, not with anger, but with a strong and steady voice. "We're not here to argue, and we won't disrespect this event, but we need to ask you something." Charles tilted his head slightly, waiting. Mark continued, softer this time. "Today is about your son. It should be his moment, not one where old decisions follow him like shadows." Charles's face didn't change. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He simply listened. Jake added, "Please, let him have this day, a clean one, without questions or whispers." There was no threat in their tone, only a request from 2 men who had held on to a piece of the past, hoping one day they could bring it forward without bitterness. Charles looked past them toward the stage. He could see Liam in the distance, lining up with his fellow cadets. The pride in his chest remained, but something else began to grow beside it, a quiet understanding. He didn't need to be told what the SEALs were referring to. He had lived with that memory too, for years, and he knew that his presence here, in uniform, might mean more than he had realized. Not just to Liam, but to others who had been part of that long-ago mission. Without saying a word, Charles reached up and removed his hat, holding it gently by his side. He gave the two men a slow, respectful nod. Then he turned and walked toward the back of the hall. He didn't make a scene. No one clapped. No one gasped. Most people didn't even notice. But Liam noticed. From across the room, just before stepping onto the stage, he caught sight of his father walking away. His brows drew together in quiet confusion. This wasn't like his father, to leave without explanation. Liam's eyes followed him until the tall, proud figure disappeared through the main doors. He felt something in his chest tighten, but he had no answers. Back at the front, Jake and Mark stood still for a moment longer, watching Charles leave. They didn't feel victorious. This wasn't about winning. It was about making space. For Liam, for the memory of someone lost, and maybe for closure. As they returned to their seats, a strange silence settled between them. They had done what they believed was right. But something about the way Charles had walked away, not broken, not angry, just silent and dignified, left them wondering if they had misunderstood more than they realized. And in the back of the hall, out of view, 6 men in Royal Guard uniforms stood up slowly from their chairs. They had served under Charles Whitcomb, and they had seen everything. The large clock near the stage ticked closer to the hour. Soon the ceremony would begin. A voice came over the speakers, gently asking everyone to take their seats. Slowly the guests began to settle down, their conversations fading into quiet murmurs. The air now carried a sense of formality and expectation, but while the hall became more still, something unspoken was building. Commander Jake Rollins and Chief Petty Officer Mark DeVries had just returned to their seats. Neither of them spoke, but their thoughts were heavy. They had approached Major Charles Whitcomb moments earlier and quietly asked him to leave the hall, believing that his presence at his son's graduation might bring unwanted attention to a past incident. Charles had not argued. He had simply removed his hat, nodded, and walked out with calm dignity. To most people in the room, nothing unusual had happened, but not to Liam. From his place behind the curtain, Liam had seen his father turn and leave. His eyes followed the tall figure moving through the guests, not in shame or anger, but with a kind of stillness that Liam didn't understand. He knew his father well. Charles Whitcomb didn't walk away from important moments. He was not a man to quit, to retreat, or to go unnoticed, especially not on a day like this. Something was wrong. Liam felt it deep inside him, though he didn't yet know why. Just behind the back rows of the audience, 6 men in Royal Guard uniforms stood quietly along the wall. They had arrived early that morning and had found seats away from the front, away from the spotlight. They wore the same crisp uniforms, each showing signs of years of service, honor, and discipline. These were not ordinary guests. They were soldiers who had once served under Major Whitcomb. When Charles had entered the hall earlier, they had noticed him at once. Some had nodded in quiet respect. Others simply observed him silently, knowing his character. But when they saw him leave, especially after the brief conversation with the American SEALs, they felt a shift. They knew what this was about. Each of those 6 men had been part of a mission years ago, a mission that had included both British and American teams. A mission that had been successful in some ways but marked forever by one very hard decision. A decision made by Major Charles Whitcomb. It was a moment that had tested loyalty, courage, and personal cost. Some people had only heard parts of the story. Others had judged it from a distance. But these 6 guardsmen had been there. They had lived it. And they remembered the truth. One of them, Sergeant Peter Halford, glanced at the others. He didn't speak, but they understood. Without needing to say a word, The 6 men silently agreed on something. They would not let this moment pass like this, not with misunderstanding in the air, not with silence taking the place of respect. Meanwhile, Liam was backstage, preparing for the procession. He adjusted his cap and checked his name tag one more time. The instructors gave final instructions, lining up the cadets in perfect order. The ceremony was about to begin. Back in the hall, the speaker returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Royal Military Academy's graduation ceremony. Today we celebrate the strength, dedication, and leadership of the graduating class. These young men and women have trained with honor, and now they step into their futures as officers." Polite applause followed. Then the names began. One by one. The graduates walked up to the stage to receive their commissions. Family members clapped and smiled, capturing photos and videos, some even wiping tears of joy. It was a proud day for every family in the room. But Jake and Mark, though clapping politely, felt a growing weight in their chests. They had asked Charles to leave, something they believed would protect the dignity of the ceremony. Yet now that he was gone, the silence felt heavier than expected. They hadn't expected Charles to agree so quickly, so quietly. They hadn't expected to feel unsettled by his absence. They certainly hadn't expected what was about to happen next. As Liam's name was announced, the hall filled with loud applause. He stepped forward proudly, his steps confident, his face serious. This was the moment he had worked for. Years of discipline, training, and commitment. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, he did not see the one he had wanted most. His father was not there. Still, he walked up to the stage and received his commission. He stood tall, not letting his confusion show, but in his heart questions echoed. Why did he leave? What happened? Did something go wrong? As Liam turned to face the audience, the applause began to slow. Then, something unexpected happened. At the back of the hall, 6 royal guardsmen stood, up from their chairs. The sound of their boots echoed softly against the wooden floor. They walked forward slowly but with purpose, their expressions calm, their uniforms gleaming. Whispers began to rise around the room as guests noticed the unusual movement. The guardsmen did not head toward the stage, but toward the center aisle. Once, there they stopped. Standing shoulder to shoulder, they faced the front of the hall and raised their arms in a sharp, respectful salute. But they weren't saluting Liam. Their eyes were fixed on the exit, the very door through which Major Whitcomb had left. The entire room fell quiet. The applause faded. The whispers stopped. Even the instructors on stage paused, unsure of what was happening. Then, from among the 6, Sergeant Halford stepped forward just slightly. His voice was strong but full of feeling. "We honor this young officer today," he said, his words clear and steady. "But we also recognize the man who shaped him, a man who made choices that cost him praise but protected others. He paused. Major Charles Whitcomb did not walk away from duty. He walked away today so that his son's light could shine without shadows. But we will not let his sacrifice be forgotten." The silence in the room became complete. Even Jake and Mark sat motionless, taken by surprise. Their earlier decision, once so certain, now felt more complex, more layered than they had allowed themselves to admit. The 6 guardsmen lowered their salutes and returned to their place at the back. They didn't wait for applause. They didn't expect recognition. They had spoken the truth, not with anger but with honor. Liam stood on the stage, eyes wide, throat tight. In that quiet moment, he understood. His father hadn't left out of shame. He had left out of love. And the respect, now filling the room, wasn't just for him. It was also for the man who had silently stepped away. The hall was still. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if time had stopped after the 6 royal guardsmen gave their unexpected tribute. People had come to celebrate the new graduates, but now they found themselves caught in a deeper moment. One filled with respect, memory, and quiet reflection. Liam was still standing on the stage holding his certificate. He looked calm on the outside, but inside his thoughts were spinning. Just moments before, he had been confused, even hurt, by his father's sudden departure. Now he understood. His father had not left because he didn't care. He had stepped away because he cared too much. Charles Whitcomb had chosen to give Liam the spotlight, even if it meant disappearing from the picture. The 6 guardsmen returned to their seats without expecting any reward. They didn't need to be thanked. They had spoken with their actions, and they had done what they believed was right. Back in their seats, Commander Jake Rollins and Chief Petty Officer Mark DeVries were silent. Their eyes followed the guardsmen as they sat down again. The message had been clear, powerful but gentle. It wasn't angry, it didn't accuse, but it did something unexpected. It made Jake and Mark stop and think more deeply about the man they had just asked to leave. Jake looked down at the program in his hand. He saw Liam's name along with his achievements. Top of his class, it said, awarded for leadership, service, and character. Liam had earned everything on that paper. But Jake couldn't help but ask himself a quiet question. What kind of father raises a son like that? The rest of the ceremony continued, but the mood had changed. People paid more attention. They clapped more meaningfully, and they watched each graduate with deeper respect. After the final cadet received their certificate, the head officer stepped to the podium. Today we honor not only these fine young officers, he said, but also the stories behind them, the sacrifices, the families, the mentors. Let us carry forward not just the pride of achievement, but the values that shaped it. Another round of applause filled the hall. This time, it was not just for the graduates, but for everything the day had revealed. Liam walked off the stage and was quickly surrounded by fellow cadets, instructors, and friends. They congratulated him, shook his hand, and praised his calm and grace on stage. He smiled, thanked them, and gave polite nods, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept looking toward the back of the hall, hoping to see his father there. But the seat remained empty. After a while, the crowd began to move toward the outdoor garden, where light refreshments were being served. Liam stayed behind for a moment, taking in the empty stage. He quietly stepped down and began walking toward the main doors. Outside, the air was fresh and cool. The green lawns of the academy stretched out before him. He looked around, and then he saw a figure standing alone near a line of trees. It was his father. Major Charles Whitcomb stood in silence, hands behind his back, eyes on the open sky. His uniform was still perfectly in place. He hadn't gone far. He had simply stepped out of the way, letting the moment belong to his son. Liam walked toward him slowly. He wasn't sure what he would say. Part of him still felt confused. But more than anything, he wanted to understand. Charles turned when he heard footsteps. When he saw Liam, a small smile appeared. Just a gentle curve of the lips, the kind only a father gives when words are not enough. "You left," Liam said softly. "I did," Charles replied, just as softly. "It was your day. I didn't want my name to become a distraction." "You didn't have to," Liam said, shaking his head. "You should have stayed." Charles looked at his son, his eyes filled with quiet strength. "Sometimes," he said, "the best way to protect someone is not by standing next to them, but by stepping back. Not because you are less proud, but because your presence might carry a story that doesn't belong to the moment." Liam stayed silent. He was trying to understand not just the words, but the years behind them. "I saw the seals," Liam said. "I saw them speak to you." Charles nodded slowly. "They carry something heavy," he said, "and part of that weight has my name on it. Years ago, in a mission I had to make a choice. It wasn't easy. But I chose what I believed was right, even though I knew it might be misunderstood. Some people only see the outcome. They don't see the reasons." Liam's voice was soft. "I want to know the reasons." Charles took a breath and looked down for a moment. "There were lives at stake," he said. "Not just soldiers, civilians, innocent people. I gave the order to move, in a way that saved many, but it meant that not everyone made it out. One of the SEALs didn't return. It broke the team. And while some understood, others didn't. I don't blame them. Their pain is real. But I accepted the blame. because that's what leadership sometimes requires. Liam felt a knot in his throat. For years he had seen his father as a figure of strength, discipline, and honor, but now he saw something deeper. Quiet sacrifice. "I saw what the Guardsmen did," Liam said, eyes moist. Charles smiled again, this time with a little more warmth. "They are good men," he said. "They knew the whole story. I never asked them to speak, but sometimes silence is too heavy and someone has to break it." Liam stepped closer. "I'm proud of you, not just for your service, but for what you gave up, and still give up." Charles placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "And I am proud of you. You walked across that stage like a true officer. You carried yourself with strength, even when things didn't make sense. That's the kind of leader the world needs." They stood there for a few moments in silence, father and son, 2 generations of service, courage, and quiet understanding. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the academy grounds. From a distance, a few people noticed the 2 figures standing side by side. They didn't hear the words exchanged, but they could see the connection, a bond not broken by misunderstanding but made stronger by it. As the evening continued, people returned to their lives. Some left with memories of a proud day, others left with a story they would tell for years. But one thing was clear. This graduation had become more than just a ceremony. It had become a moment of truth, honor, and healing, not just for one family, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The sun was beginning to sink behind the tall trees surrounding the Royal Military Academy. Its soft light painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. The graduation ceremony had ended, but the emotions from it still lingered in the air like a quiet song. Liam stood beside his father on the open green lawn. Neither of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Some moments are made for silence, not the silence of confusion or distance, but the kind that comes from understanding. For Liam, the events of the day had changed everything. The proud ceremony, his name being called, the 6 royal guardsmen, standing in honor, and most of all the conversation with his father. It had opened a door into a part of Charles Whitcomb's life that had always been closed. Back inside the building, many guests had already begun to leave. Families took pictures, shook hands with instructors, and shared hugs. But a few remained. Among them were Commander Jake Rollins and Chief Petty Officer Mark DeVries. The 2 SEALs had come to the graduation expecting nothing more than a formal event. Instead, they had walked into a moment of history, one that stirred memories, challenged beliefs, and quietly touched their hearts. Jake stood near a marble pillar, arms crossed. He stared through a tall glass window at the field where Charles and Liam now stood. Mark was beside him, also watching. "Did we do the right thing?" Mark asked quietly. Jake didn't answer, right away. "When we asked him to leave," Mark added, "did it solve anything? Or did we just open old wounds?" Jake let out a slow breath. "We came here with old pain in our hearts," he said. "But I think we forgot that others were carrying pain too." Mark nodded, looking down at the program in his hands. The guardsmen, they weren't just honoring a soldier, they were correcting a story. Jake glanced at him. "Maybe it's time we do the same." Outside, Charles turned to Liam with a calm expression. "You'll be starting your new post soon," he said. "How are you feeling?" Liam took a deep breath. "Excited and nervous. It feels real now, more than ever." Charles smiled gently. "That's normal. The uniform may feel heavy at first, but in time you'll learn how to wear it with your own strength." Liam looked up. "Dad, will people ever forget what happened years ago? What they think about you?" Charles didn't hesitate. "Maybe not," he said. "But the goal isn't to be remembered without mistakes. It's to be remembered for standing by your decisions, especially when they are difficult." Then a soft voice interrupted them. "Major Whitcomb?" Charles turned around and saw Jake and Mark walking toward him. Their faces were not cold now. They didn't wear the firm expressions of judgment they had earlier. Instead, they looked Thoughtful, even humble. Charles nodded slightly. Commander, Chief. Jake stepped forward, then paused. For a moment he searched for the right words, not to win a debate, not to make a point, but to say something honest. I wanted to say, Jake began, that earlier today, when we approached you, we believed we were protecting the ceremony, but maybe we were protecting ourselves. Charles stayed quiet, listening. Mark spoke next. We lost someone important on that mission. You know that. We've carried that loss a long time. For us, it was easier to carry it with blame. But today, we saw something else. Jake looked at Liam. Your son is proof that honor lives on, that leadership leaves a legacy. Liam gave a respectful nod but kept quiet, letting the moment belong to the men who needed to speak. Jake turned back to Charles. We may never agree on everything about what happened. But after today, I believe we were wrong to judge your silence as guilt. It might have been courage all along. There was a stillness in the air, followed by something simple, a gesture of peace. Jake reached out his hand. Charles looked at it for a moment. Then he extended his own and gave it a firm, respectful shake. No more words were needed between them. That handshake was not just between two soldiers. It was between two experiences, two versions of the same story, finally meeting in the middle. Mark smiled and added, There's a quiet kind of leadership, the kind that doesn't shout but teaches through presence. I think we all saw that today. Charles looked at his son and said quietly, It's not just mine anymore. It belongs to him now. The four men stood together on the green lawn, the shadows growing longer as the sun slipped lower. Behind them, the building lights began to turn on, glowing softly through the windows. Later, at the reception inside the Academy Hall, the mood had changed. People talked not only about the future but also about what they had witnessed. Guests spoke about honor, about humility, and about how the truth sometimes arrives without warning, wrapped in silence and simple gestures. The 6 Royal Guardsmen were quietly thanked by several people. They accepted the words with grace, never trying to take credit. One of them, Sergeant Halford, said gently, Sometimes stories take years. The evening air inside the Academy Hall was warm and bright with soft lighting. Tables were set with simple refreshments, sandwiches, fruit, tea, and coffee. Graduates in their uniforms mixed with families, instructors, and the visiting officers. Everywhere you looked, people smiled, laughed, and spoke of the day's events. But beneath the smiles, a deeper sense of connection lingered, one born of shared experience, respect, and newfound understanding. Liam stood near a table of pastries, sipping tea and listening to his fellow graduates' plans. Some would stay in the city, others were headed overseas. They spoke excitedly of training exercises, leadership roles, and the chance to serve their country. But even amid the chatter, Liam's thoughts kept drifting back to his father, Major Charles Whitcomb, and to the 2 American officers, Jake Rollins and Mark DeVries. Across the room, Charles stood quietly in a corner, watching the scene with a gentle pride. He had watched Liam grow from a small boy learning to tie his first tie into the confident young officer he was now. He had guided him through drills, homework, and life lessons, and now, seeing his son celebrated by both British and American soldiers, Charles felt a calm satisfaction. The past had been painful, but today had been healing. Jake and Mark moved through the crowd together. They had spent much of the afternoon talking with instructors about joint operations and the future of both forces. But after their talk with Charles, they had shared a quieter conversation about friendship, loss, and the meaning of true honor. Now they paused near Charles, offering him a nod and a respectful smile. Charles nodded back, and for a moment, the 3 men simply stood in silent camaraderie. At that moment, Liam approached them. His expression was serious but kind. Father, he said softly, then turned to Jake and Mark. Thank you, for today, for what you did and for what you said. Jake smiled and ruffled Liam's hair in a friendly way. You did well today, Lieutenant Whitcomb, he said. Your father would be proud of you no matter what. but you showed real grace in everything." Mark added, "You led with honor, and that's what matters most." Liam looked at his father and then back at the two SEALs. "Thank you for honoring him," he said. "I think I understand more now." Charles placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "And that is my greatest hope," he said. "That you understand why difficult choices matter, and why sometimes the hardest path is also the right one." As they spoke, the 6 Royal Guardsmen who had formed the silent tribute earlier slipped into the group. Sergeant Peter Halford stepped forward, his uniform crisp, his bearing humble. He held a small wooden box. Wordlessly, he opened it to reveal a silver pin, a small replica of the Academy's crest. It was the kind of pin given to officers who had shown exceptional character. "This is for you, Major Whitcomb," Sergeant Halford said, carefully lifting the pin with gloved fingers. "For your service, your sacrifice, and for the lesson you taught us all today." Charles was surprised but honored. He accepted the pin and, with a slight nod, attached it to his uniform. The small gesture brought quiet applause from those nearby. No loud cheers, just a respectful acknowledgement of a man who had borne more than most would ever know. Liam stepped forward and embraced his father. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. Charles hugged his son back. "I'm proud of you too," he replied. Jake and Mark watched the scene, their faces softened by emotion. They had come to honor the newest officers, but they left with a deeper respect for the man who had shaped one of them. They realized that sometimes the greatest victories are not on the battlefield, but in the choices we make for each other. As the reception wound down, people began to drift away. Some traveled back to their homes, others to their barracks. Liam and Charles walked together toward the main doors. Behind them, Jake and Mark joined, sharing a final word or two. Outside, the campus was calm under a starry sky. The grand stone buildings stood like old friends, witnessing another chapter in their long history. Father and son paused at the edge of the lawn, looking up at the stars. Liam broke the silence. "What's next for you, Father?" Charles smiled. "I'll finish my final year here, help train the next class, and then we'll see. Maybe write a few notes on leadership and service. I've learned a thing or two over the years." Liam grinned. "And what about me? I leave for my first post in 2 weeks." "That's right," Charles said. "You'll do well. You'll do. Remember what you learned today about courage, humility, and speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves." They stood together for a moment, then turned to walk back toward the housing quarters. As they walked, Liam slipped his arm through his father's. It felt like the start of something new, a journey walked side by side. A few yards behind them, Jake and Mark watched them go. Then Jake spoke. "I think today changed me." Mark nodded. "Me too. We came with old pain, but we leave with hope." Jake looked over at his friend. "Shall we head back to base? We've got an early morning meeting." Mark laughed softly. "Yes, Commander. Let's go." They walked off together under the quiet night sky, 2 old soldiers bound by respect and understanding. Meanwhile, back in his room, Liam unpacked a small box of mementos. Among them was his father's old service pin, a photo of the 2 of them at Liam's first parade, and the new Academy crest pin. He placed them carefully on his desk, lined up in order of significance. The last spot was reserved for the day's certificate, his first symbol as an officer. As he turned off the light and lay in bed, Liam thought back on every moment. The ceremony, his father's silent departure, the guardsman's tribute, the handshake with the SEALs, and the final pin. He drifted to sleep with a peaceful heart, ready for whatever lay ahead. The next morning, the sun rose golden over the academy. The dew on the grass sparkled like diamonds. In the officers' quarters, Liam dressed in his uniform, buttoning each button with care. He paused before the mirror and straightened his tie. Then he picked up his phone and sent a message. "Thank you, Father, for everything." Not long after, Charles received the text. He looked out his window at the training field, where new cadets were already standing in formation. He tapped a quick reply, "You make it easy." And as the day began for both father and son, one training the new generation, the other embarking on his first mission, they carried with them the lessons of the night before, that honor isn't always loud, that sacrifice often happens in silence, and that true leadership shines brightest when it serves others. And somewhere miles away, in a quiet office at a naval base, Jake Rollins and Mark DeVries read a report on the ceremony. They looked at each other, nodded, and went back to work. Strangers no more, but comrades linked by a story that transcended uniforms, countries, and time.